we're going to have to be vigilant on two different fronts. We're going to have to defend the truth about the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, created male and female, created for marriage. We're also going to have to defend our freedom to live according to those truths.
Dr. Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and member of the White House Religious Liberty Commission, speaking at this year's Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference.
Over and over again, we're going to see that we have to form the next generation of our students, of our children, our grandchildren to believe the truth, while also defending our freedom to live it out. And then the long game is reforming our civil laws to reflect the truth.
You can watch Ryan Anderson's presentation, Making the Case for Social Conservatism, from the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference. For a donation of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch an on-demand video stream and download audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org.
I think the fate of Christianity in Europe should be very, very sobering for Christians in America and make them realize that nothing can be taken for granted at this point.
What you actually can affirm for your child is you are baptized. You don't need to be defined by this gender dysphoria that's nagging at you and trying to get you to carve up your body and make all these changes. You are actually defined by what God says.
Union with the flesh of Jesus. There is nothing greater than that. And American evangelicalism cannot say that. It's a disembodied Christ. There's no Jesus in the water, Jesus in the Word, Jesus in your ear, Jesus in your mouth.
All of the Lutherans from the very beginning to the very end teach not only that good works are to be done, but even the necessity of good works.
Grocery clerks in Tennessee love listening to Issues, Etc.
As we track the history of the great republics, one must catch our attention. We think of Venice as just a tourist destination, but in fact, it has a history of one of the greatest republics in human history and one of the longest-lived ones as well. Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in live on this Thursday afternoon, the 13th of August. Dr. Thomas Madden joins us to continue our series on the rise and fall of the great republics. He's professor of history at St. Louis University and author of the new book, The Fall of Republics, A History from Ancient Carthage to the American Constitution. Dr. Madden, welcome back.
Thank you, Todd. Glad to be here.
We could talk a lot about the medieval republics, in particular the Italian ones that were so notable in history, but you say that Venice is kind of the mother of them all. Why is that?
Well, it's certainly the longest lived republic of all of them. It begins really in the 7th century AD with the election of the first Doge of Venice, who's the executive of the mixed government republic. And it continues for over 1,000 years, really 11 centuries before it finally falls. And even then, it only falls because it's destroyed by Napoleon. So it was well understood throughout the Middle Ages that Venice had managed to create a great republic, a republic that became solid. It changed over time, but it became a very solid, very stable system. In fact, the nickname for the Venetian government was La Serenissima, the most serene, because it was so stable. And it continued throughout the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages. There were many imitators, particularly in the other Italian cities, like Florence or Milan, Genoa, Pisa. There were a number of other attempts to create republics similar to Venice, but ultimately they all failed. They all collapsed well within a century and were taken over by strongmen. But Venice continued throughout that period. And in the book, I call it the Republican thread stretching across the Middle Ages. And I use that imagery because Venice is born in the fall of the Roman Empire. And this is an age in which there are no republics. Really, anywhere in the world, there are no mixed government republics. And Venice develops one in this brackish lagoon And it's a thread that stretches all through the feudal Middle Ages, where this is a world of kings and emperors and popes and very powerful bishops. And in Venice, you have a free people who live within a republic for century after century. And it will last long enough, well into the late 18th century, where Venice can see the dawn of a new age of modern republics. And so it was always understood throughout the Middle Ages, but especially in the periods in the 16th and 17th century, when you have all these various thinkers like Machiavelli and later Harrington, of these Republican thinkers, they all looked to Venice because that was the clear example of a republic that was stable and that could last century upon century upon century.
So tell us more about how this great Italian republic was founded.
Yeah, well, if you go to Venice, and as many people do, it's filled with tourists now. But if you go there, it's a very beautiful place. It's a city built on the water, out on these islands in this lagoon. And you have to imagine who it was that decided that this was a good place to build a city. And the answer is no one with a choice would do something like that. These were people without a choice. They were out of options. And so the origins of the city come in the last days of the Roman Empire in the West. So in the 4th century, and particularly in the 5th and the 6th centuries, you have these Germanic barbarian groups coming into the Roman Empire in the West, conquering, destroying. It's a very chaotic time. You also have the Huns who are arriving under Attila, who come into the Veneto as well. They destroy the city of Aquileia, and they continue forward. Attila continues into Italy itself. So it's a time of great chaos. There are a lot of cities that were Roman cities that were in the Veneto area. This is the area at the northern top of the Adriatic Sea. And these towns all had a very close relationship with the lagoon area because their ships would come in and out of the canals there. And oftentimes many of them would have vacation homes or fishing shacks out in the islands of the lagoon. So when these invaders would come, frequently people who would grab as much of their belongings as they could, and they would go out into the lagoon. And in the early parts of these invasions, they would just wait for the invaders to leave, and then they would go back home and try to clean up. But by the 6th century, you're getting now invaders that are not going to leave. In particular, in the 7th century, when the Lombards arrive, these are Germanic groups that are coming to settle. And so when they conquer the territory, they're just not going to leave. These Romans, then, what's left of Romans in the West, they pack up all their belongings, finally, and go and settle onto the sandy islands out in the lagoon. And the reason they do is because it's safe there. The Germanic groups, they don't have navies, they can't come out into the lagoon. Plus, the lagoon, when people look at Venice, they see water everywhere, but the average depth is only about 5 feet. Much of it is fairly shallow water. There are deep channels, but you have to know where they are. And so if you're going to bring a fleet in, you'll have to know where those channels are. When an attacker comes, the Venetians can remove the markers and even fill up the channels to keep a navy from getting to them. So, and without that, there's no effective way to bring a military in. So they went there because it was a watery fortress. It was a way of staying safe. But it also was kind of part of their own culture. From the earliest periods, they saw themselves as Romans who were refusing to accept the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. And so they were refusing essentially to cooperate with a new medieval age. So they went out into the lagoons. They insisted that they were still Romans. They believed that they were still obedient to the Roman emperors who still ruled from Constantinople in the east, and therefore they had a very close relationship with Constantinople throughout their history. And the Venetians used to like to say that they were Rome unfallen. They were the one place in Western Europe that had never been conquered by the invasions. And so they took great pride in that. And their republic kind of developed out of that idea. Now, of course, the Rome that fell was no republic, it was an empire. But their republic would develop in the lagoon in an organic way, the same way that the Roman Republic had developed way, way back more than 1,000 years before.
Talk a little bit about the interplay of the Catholic Church in the formation of, or at least the Roman Church in the formation of the Venetian Republic.
One of the big differences between the Germanic groups that were coming in and the native Romans was the Catholic faith. The Romans were part of the Catholic Church. They were obedient to the popes in Rome. And the Germans who were coming in, they were what are called Arian Christians. Nowadays, they would be you'd be hard pressed to find the difference between them. Their churches were very similar. The rituals and liturgies were very similar. The primary difference was that the Arian Christians believed that Christ was divine, but not a deity. He was kind of like a demigod, but wasn't co-equal with the Father. And that caused a lot of tension, obviously, and that was one of the reasons why they wanted to flee. In the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire, you also, though, had a complete breakdown, obviously, of civil control. There was no government anymore to run things. There was no one to police the roads or to provide for a common defense, to put together a military or to even repair walls or take out the garbage. Everything was torn apart. And so in that vacuum, in those centuries, the only hierarchy that survived was the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And so bishops would find themselves in a position, particularly in towns, where they would have to take on the responsibility that the government took before. And so the self-identification of people became very much around their religious community and also around their patron saints. So, for example, if we look at the Italian group that would ultimately become Venice, it was the city of Altinum or Altino. Today, the ruins of it are very close to the Venetian airport on the mainland. But that community had a bishop, Paul, and they also had a patron saint, Heliodorus. And so when it became clear that they were going to have to leave their city for good, they took everything that they could, and including the body and the bishop, and they followed the bishop. The bishop was the one who was praying for guidance and who ultimately led them to an island not far away, less than 20 miles away, of Torcello. And there they placed the body of their patron saint, and they then built a church there, the church that would later be Santa Maria Assunta. And they were assisted in this endeavor by the Roman authorities in Constantinople and in Ravenna in Italy. So that became kind of the nucleus of what would become a Venetian people there on that island. And it would grow quite a bit. Torcello grew to be quite a very populous island. And other groups also began leaving from the mainland, not just from Altinum, but from Padua, Treviso, from Aquileia. All these various groups would come out into the lagoon, and they would create their own new communities out there. But the one that became Venice was that group from Altino. that built up Torcello and then eventually spread onto the Lido as well.
We're talking with Dr. Thomas Madden. He's professor of history at St. Louis University. It's part 3 of our series on the rise and fall of the great republics. We'll talk about the Doge next.
The church's music from the 2nd century.
Shepherd of tender youth, guiding in love and truth.
The 6th century. The 12th century. The 16th century. The 21st century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
A podcast for thinking Christians. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
This is Pastor Matthew Harrison, President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The LCMS operates the second largest parochial school system in the United States. What can you expect from a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school? There's one race, the human race. And Jesus died for the sins of every man, woman, and child from every land and every nation. Life begins at conception. All life is precious from womb to tomb. And every student, parent, and teacher is created in the very image of God. There's right and wrong, and we know which is which from the Ten Commandments. There are only two sexes, male and female. He created them. Marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman. There's such a thing as objective, absolute truth, and it's found in the person and work of Jesus Christ and His Word. To find a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school near you, visit lcms.org/schools.
Welcome back. I'm Todd Wilkins. This is Issues, Etc. On this Thursday, August the 13th, it's part 3 of our series on the rise and fall of the great republics. We're talking about Venice. How would you describe this figure of the Doge?
Well, the word Doge is just from the Venetian dialect, and it just means duke. And duke is an Anglicization of the Latin word for a leader. So it could mean anything. And of course, duke in Western Europe became a kind of a feudal lord. But that's not at all what it was in Venice. The first Doge was elected in 697. And the idea was that all of these various islands that had been settled, they all had various leaders that were known as tribunes on them. And there were so many people that were moving out into the lagoons that they needed to have kind of a central government. And so the Patriarch of Grotto, who was the spiritual head of the lagoon, he suggested that the tribunes come together and elect a Doge or leader. And so that's how it started. Again, as I say, it was very organic. In each case, they were simply trying to deal with a problem that had come up. And this problem in this case was that there had been a lot of warfare between these islands and a lot of violence. And so the hope was that a Doge would be able to pacify that and bring everyone together. Now, it didn't really work, at least initially. The centuries that followed that, in the 8th century, the 9th century, and even into the 10th century, there would still be a fair amount of factional violence as the Republic was still forming. But the idea of the Doge became he became kind of the face of the Republic. So you can kind of think of them, particularly in the mature Republic of Venice, as a sort of like a president, although much less powerful. Doges did not have the authority to lead troops or command the military forces. They could conduct foreign policy, but only when they worked with their small council, which was a group that was in the palace with them. So they were very strictly limited. In fact, over the course of the history of the Republic, whenever a Doge was elected, they would take an oath of office. And at least from the 12th century onward, we have these oaths of offices, and they're primarily oaths of what you will not do, not what you will do. And it was because the Venetians were very, very suspicious of concentrated power. That's what gave birth to their republic. And they did not want to elect someone who was going to become a king. So doges were elected initially in the early years. They would be elected simply by acclamation. So the people in the lagoon would all get together into a central square, and they would just start screaming names until enough people started screaming the same name. Not unlike how bishops were often chosen in various cities, including the Pope was chosen in these early years in much the same way. So these doges were hemmed in by the elements of the Republic, largely by their small council, and then later on, by the 11th century, you have what's known as the Great Council, which is a larger body of leading men in the city who would then come together and draft legislation and otherwise see to the administration of the city. There would be doges throughout the history of Venice from 697 until 1797, at the end of the Republic. They were the face of the Republic, but they were very, very constrained in the powers that they had.
Talk a little bit about the growing economic strength of the Venetian Republic.
Yeah, that's the economy of Venice was very much behind the reason that they created a republic in the first place. Mixed government republics, they are a rare form of government in throughout history, and they are usually come about for different reasons. If you look at like the Republic of Sparta, they needed to have each citizen highly trained and highly devoted to the republic. But if you look at a republic like Carthage, the Carthaginians were businessmen. They were traders. They did business all across the Mediterranean. And Venice is very similar. Venice, because the Venetians lived out in a brackish lagoon, I mean, that was their home. They did not have the ability to do agriculture on any kind of scale. You can grow some grapes and other things out there, but you can't grow very much food out on the sands of the lagoon. So for food, they rely on agricultural estates on the mainland. And that means they need to barter with what they have. Now, in the early years, they have salt works out in the lagoon, so they often will trade salt or fish for the food that they need from the mainland. But over time, they end up becoming merchants because they're very obviously very good on the water, and they trade first along the Po River, then later throughout the Adriatic, and then also because of their connections with Constantinople, they begin doing a lot of trade in the big city of Constantinople. So the business of Venice is business. These are merchants, and their whole business model is sailing around, buying low and selling high. And that capitalism, in fact, really modern capitalism, is developed in Venice and to a certain extent in Florence later as well. But the basic elements of what we take for granted today of being capitalist, ideas of liquid wealth, of deposit banking, these ideas are all being developed in Venice to do business. When you have a bunch of businessmen who are the ones who are amassing the wealth, there are certain things that businessmen like. They like stable governments, things being predictable. They don't like major wars. They want to see things in a very predictable, steady way. And that's what they valued in their government. And that helped to create the Venetian government. They also, because of the nature of liquid wealth, it's not like landed wealth. If you are in the whole rest of Europe is all based on feudalism. So if you're, a local lord, or you're a duke or a count who has vast estates, those estates will remain in your family unless someone comes and physically takes them from you. Those are your lands, and you will be a landed gentry, and you will be a nobility for the foreseeable future. But in Venice, there's almost no land. So it's all based on liquid wealth. And that means if you have the most money, then you're the most important person. And by its nature, money is fleeting. You can have a family that is very wealthy, but then their next generation doesn't do as well. And so they go on hard times. And so you have this constant flux of people. And that means that those who have wealth want to ensure that they have a say in the government. And the people with those wealths are constantly churning. So it's antithetical to the concepts of a landed gentry, obviously, of a permanent nobility, but also it's antithetical to the idea of dynasty. The Venetians hated the concept of dynasty. And whenever the surest way for a doge to get into trouble with the people was for him to try to get his son in as a successor. Several doges did it, and it never really ended well. Because as soon as the people started to think a doge was trying to create a dynasty for himself, they would move against him. But it's very much that those dynamics within that capitalist society that kept the republic healthy and ensured that everyone was on the same page as far as making sure that everyone was equal as far as their ability to make money and also to have a say in the government.
Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. He's author of the new book, The Fall of Republics, A History from Ancient Carthage to the American Constitution. We'll talk a little bit about the place Venice occupied between empires next.
And I think we have to ask, do today's Marxist activists have any reason to say that they hate above anyone else in the world the church leaders most celebrated by our cultural elites? Or do they find that their efforts are not only not hampered by Christian cultural elites, but are in fact helped by them?
Megan Basham of the Daily Wire, speaking at the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
We must resist the infiltrators and use our power in such a way that when those who oppose the cause of Christ are asked who they hate most in the world, they think of our names.
You can watch Megan Basham making the case against progressive influence in the church from this year's Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service.
Our church loves and is grateful for those that serve our country. Operation Barnabas, part of Ministry to the Armed Forces, equips you to reach out to veterans in your community to bring Christ to those that served. Call Ministry to the Armed Forces at 314-996-1337 or email lcmschaps@lcms.org.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
God bless our military.
Others talk. We have something to say. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Whoever desires to be a preacher desires a good thing.
Dr. Cameron McKenzie, professor of historical theology at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana.
It's a very good thing. It's a very wonderful thing to be called to apply God's word to the lives of God's people. There's nothing more important and really more rewarding than to bring a child into the kingdom of God through infant baptism, and then at the other end of life to see a child of God pass from this life and into heaven, and to be an instrument that God uses to do those things and others like them. It's just an amazing and wonderful privilege.
For information about studying for the vocation of pastor, visit ctsfw.edu, Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Welcome back to Issues, Etc. Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. It's part 3 of our series on the rise and fall of the great republics. Dr. Madden, you've spoken here about the kind of near geography of Venice as this series of islands and a lagoon republic. But it's also positioned kind of between the old Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. How did that affect its history?
Yes, very much. And in fact, if you just visit Venice today, you can see that kind of fusion of these Italian palazzi, which have a very Western flavor to them, but also when you look at the Venetian Gothic of the windows, for example, or the traceries, it's all very Eastern, because these merchants were going back and forth to the Byzantine world, also to the Arab world, and they would bring this cultural components back with them. So it was always very much in between the two. Venice, in the earliest period, these are, of course, Romans. And since Roman authority has completely dissolved in the West, they are looking to Constantinople, to the Byzantine, what we call the Byzantine Empire, as their leaders. And so they have a direct connection to them because that's Roman authority. As the centuries go on, though, as Venice becomes really its own government and its own republic, their merchants are doing business all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, very much in Constantinople. In fact, in Constantinople, they would have a quarter, an area of the city that was Venetian, just theirs. There were occasions where there would be as many Venetians living in Constantinople as there were in Venice, because there was so much business to be done there. And they had other quarters in other cities as well, like Tyre, in the Crusader states. So they did business throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and all of that money, of course, brought more and more money into Venice. So it became very, very wealthy. Because of this, Venice found itself dealing with more and more powers. But the big change happened for them as far as empires go after the Fourth Crusade. The Venetians did a partnership with some French, and on a crusade that was supposed to be reconquering Jerusalem, but the crusade ran out of money, and ultimately it ended up at Constantinople, where a pretender to the throne offered to pay them to help him take the throne, which they did. But then the pretender to the throne, Alexius, decided not to pay the money he promised. And so the Crusaders attacked the city and conquered it, amazingly. And so you have this strange spectacle of a crusade that had gone to restore Jerusalem to Christianity. And in fact, it destroyed the greatest Christian city in the world, Constantinople. But because of the sacking and destruction of Constantinople, Venice, which was part of that crusade, found itself now in a difficult situation because the Byzantines had patrolled the seas of the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean and provided for that stable system. And now that was gone. So the Venetians discovered that they had to step into that vacuum. And so that's really the beginning of Venice's overseas empire. And it would grow to be quite large. They would completely take control over all of the Dalmatian coast, all the areas that are today Croatia, for example, Albania, much of Greece, Venice would have control over at different periods. And in fact, the entire island of Crete would be a Venetian holding for centuries, many centuries. And they would have territories even as far away as the Black Sea. So it became a very large maritime empire. And so that put them even more in between East and West because so many of their territories were now in the East. That, of course, in the more modern period, they would find themselves also between empires, but in a different way. In that regard, they would have powerful Western empires that they would have to kind of appease. But in the Middle Ages, Venice itself became enormously wealthy and powerful, really up until the point of the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which eventually the Turks eventually started to take the Venetian territories away.
How would you describe the reforms over the long history of this republic? When does it kind of reach its peak form?
I would say certainly by 1300, it's reached the most mature form of the republic. By that time, all of the major components of the republic are there. The Doge is there, the Great Council is there, and there were reforms known as the Serrata, which essentially defined who could be in the Great Council. The Great Council was the democratic component to the Venetian Republic. And it was not elected directly by the people. It was elected by its own members, really. And these were all important, generally wealthy men who would then bring other generally wealthy men into it. And by the 13th century, it had become very closed and it was very hard to get into the Great Council. But that doesn't work in a capitalist system because you have other people, new families, who are becoming very wealthy and they want in. And so with the Serrata, what they did was they set up a basic system for people to be able to come in to the Great Council and be assured that you would be able to remain in the Great Council, provided you didn't do something terrible. You weren't guilty of treason or something of that sort. But otherwise, you could stay in the Great Council for the rest of your life. And so the Great Council grew to be quite large. At its peak, there are maybe 1,200 members of the Great Council, which meant that roughly about 1% of the population of Venice was a member of the Great Council, which is an enormously high number for representation. If you think of how many people in the United States are representatives in Congress in Washington, D.C., I mean, it's not 1%. It's a tiny, tiny percentage of the people, but they represent the rest of us. In the case of Venice, it was 1 out of every 100 people was essentially a Great Council. So everyone knew people who were in the Great Council. You saw them regularly, and you could talk to them about your concerns, and those could be reflected then in the council chamber. So the growth of the Great Council was there. You had the Senate, which was elected out of the Great Council, and the Senate would see to issues like foreign affairs primarily. The Venetians had the 2 different committees, one that would deal with Italy and then one that would deal with everything else, the Stato da Mar, which is the overseas holdings. And then you also had a number of various bureaucracies below that. So you had Senate, you had the 3 main components that you need. You had the democracy in the Great Council, you had the aristocracy in the Senate, and then you had the executive, which was the Doge and his small council. So all of those were organized into that republic, and each one able to check the other. Now, they had other groups that they would have to reform occasionally. There was another group called the 10, which the primary job of the 10 was to seek out any kind of treason or anyone who was attempting to overthrow the republic. And so they tended to act, as you would expect, in a fairly secretive manner. They were very, very expert at sifting out plots against the state when those would show up. These were fairly rare, but they'd had a few cases in which they had happened before. 1309, there was a coup attempt that failed. In 1355, there was another one that failed. And so to try to nip these in the bud, the 10 would deal with this. Many people, if they go to Venice, they'll see the Bocca del Leone, which was basically the lion's mouths. And these were places where if you knew about someone who was plotting something bad, you could put it on a piece of paper and stick it in the lion's mouth. And the 10 would then read that and would then go and investigate if they thought it was believable. So certainly by 1300, it's in its mature form, and it will continue apace throughout the centuries after that. Still a very, very stable system without, I always say one of the ways you can tell that the Venetian system was stable is just to look at the cities today. If you go to, say, Florence or any of the other major, like Milan, there's not much left in Milan, but if you look at Florence, for example, the palazzi there they're fortresses. They have bars on the windows, they have towers. Their purpose is to defend those families during factional warfare, of which there's a lot. If you go to Venice, the palazzi are not fortresses at all. In fact, they have enormous windows to let the sun in, and they're beautifully carved windows with glass everywhere. And that's because there is no factional warfare in Venice. The only towers in Venice are the bell towers of the churches. So it was a very, very stable republic.
We're talking with Dr. Thomas Madden, professor of history at St. Louis University and author of the new book, The Fall of Republics, A History from Ancient Carthage to the American Constitution. We'll talk about Venice's neutrality in Europe and then Napoleon.
This is Molly Hemingway, encouraging you to listen to my favorite podcast, Issues, Etc. Every day you get in-depth interviews with host Todd Wilkin asking expert guests substantive, thought-provoking questions on all of the important news and issues of our day. The expert guests are in culture, law, ethics, philosophy, theology, and apologetics. Expert guests, expansive topics, always extolling Christ. Issues, etc.
Looking for high-quality church music settings? Look no further than Concordia Publishing House. We have award-winning settings for handbell, organ, piano, and choral groups, featuring a wide variety of options for the entire church year. Visit cph.org/music to find a great setting today.
Solid, serious, substantive. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Lutherans for Life applies God's Word, both His law and His gospel, to all the life issues: abortion, sexual purity, assisted suicide and euthanasia, and biotechnology. If you have any questions about LFL resources, or if you want to find out more about forming a life team or life chapter, or becoming a life advocate, contact Lutherans for Life at 888-364-LIFE or at info@lutheransforlife.org.
Truth, freedom, vocation. Concordia University Chicago offers affordable graduate degrees centered in Christian truth, and our new Advance with Purpose scholarship makes them even more affordable. Employees of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod organizations and RSOs receive a 50% tuition discount on any graduate degree. Learn more at cuchicago.edu/advancewithpurpose. Concordia Chicago. With Christ at the center, we stand tall for the church.
We are talking about the Republic of Venice. It's part 3 of our series on the rise and fall of the great republics with Dr. Thomas Madden. Dr. Madden, why did the Venetian Republic opt for neutrality eventually when it came to European affairs?
It was really the only way for them to try to navigate a very difficult system. It's interesting that certainly by the 17th century, Venice found itself in sort of a way that it had in its earliest days. And that is that all of Western Europe was doing something that it didn't want to be part of. It wanted to stand aloof from that. In this case, you had the rise of the great absolutist monarchies in Europe, where you're having an enormous amount of power amassed, particularly in France before the French Revolution, or in England and in Spain. And these powers, particularly because of their overseas holdings, are immensely powerful. Venice, when we think of the age of exploration and where you start to have the exploration of the New World, but also of the circumnavigation of Africa to India, all of those things were done for reasons that Venice understood very well, and that is money. They were looking for a way to get to those luxury goods, particularly spices, the spice islands of the South Pacific, or at least to India, where the markets would be there, where you could purchase these. And they're trying to find a way to get to them, buy them at very cheap prices, and then bring them back to Europe to sell. And Venice understood this completely, but Venice's business model was based on the Mediterranean. They're a Mediterranean power. And with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, that meant that the avenues for those goods that Venice had for centuries traded was now drying up, or they had to pay an enormously large markup in Ottoman markets, either in Egypt or in Constantinople. So Venice's wealth began to decline as a result. And the great powers, the Atlantic powers, that was the future. So Portugal, Spain, France, England, those kingdoms would grow more and greater and greater and more powerful. And Venice would very much decrease. It lost its overseas holdings to Ottoman conquest. It still had lands on the terra firma in Italy, but those also were at risk with these great powers. And so Venice is completely unable to challenge them. It doesn't have the economic or the military means to do so. And so the Venetians believed that the best course of action is just to remain strictly neutral, to stay out of the wars. Venice also had its new business model as its trade declined. It branched off into a new business, which was tourism. As the wealth grew and grew in England and France, 17th century, and particularly into the 18th century, you would have these very wealthy members of these kingdoms who would, particularly when they were young, would travel around Europe, and they would want to see the main sites. And in England, for example, any kind of gentry, if you were a young man, it was assumed that you would do what was known as the Grand Tour, and you would take a better part of a year and you would travel all over. Venice was a main stop for that. You went to Rome for sure, but you would go to Venice and see the beauty and all the art and everything else, and the beauty of the city. But it was also kind of the Las Vegas of its age. So it was known also for, it had prostitutes everywhere. The sex trade was a major component there. They also had the casinos where people could gamble. And they also had opera. That was a major part of this. And of course, also other types of musical entertainment. This is the great age of Vivaldi. So it was you could get everything you needed there as a tourist stop. So to keep that going, Venice needed to remain neutral so that people from all over Europe would be able to come there and spend their money, because they were very reliant on that tourist income, particularly by the end of the 17th century. They really need that money coming in. So it was a difficult act to complete because there were such great powers out there, but they managed to do it during those periods.
So then, after the French Revolution, enter Napoleon Bonaparte. What initially, you say that he was actually had bigger fish to fry than Venice, but Venice was part of the plan. He reaches capitulation with them, but what eventually kind of tips him into saying, I'm done with Venice?
Yeah, Napoleon, this was before he had become first consul or even emperor, but when he was leading his campaign in Italy, he cast all of his campaigns as being a liberation. He was liberating all of Europe from the feudal ways. And so he was toppling governments and all of that. But his real big fish to fry was the Habsburgs. He wanted to wage war against Austria. And Venice and their territories, like Verona, that area was just in the way for him. And so Napoleon led his armies to Austria and would have to cross through Venetian territory. Now, the Venetians always insisted that they were neutral, but Napoleon pointed out that the Austrians were allowed to cross Venice's lands to get to him. But the Venetians said, but these are centuries old agreements that we have with the Austrians. This is nothing new. So Napoleon was already irritated by Venice. The larger question, though, for him was he saw Venice, ironically, he saw it as a ossified medieval relic. He was very much affected by what historians refer to as the anti-myth of Venice. And this is kind of a new thing that starts in the late 17th century, but is really kind of typified by Casanova. Casanova, who was Venetian, who escaped from Venice, and he went all over France writing and talking about how Venice was this place of dark intrigue where the people were not allowed to voice their opinions, where there were political prisoners everywhere, where if you acted against the government, you were strangled in your bed one night and no one would say anything about it. And this became fairly widely believed in France, but outside of, not so much in England, but all throughout France. This was a trope about Venice. And so Napoleon, as he's toppling these medieval kingdoms, he certainly had no love for Venice. But as I said, he was busy with other things, and so he was willing to leave Venice alone. Ultimately, though, he became convinced that the Venetians were acting against him in favor of the Austrians, which they were not. And then there was a scuffle between a French warship that tried to enter the lagoon and the Venetian defenders, and some of the French aboard that warship were killed. And that threw Napoleon into a rage. And he decided that he was going to end Venice. When he brought his troops up to the coast, now again, Venice is in the middle of a lagoon, and that lagoon had always protected them. But of course, Napoleon has artillery, which is capable of reaching Venice. And so he doesn't have to invade. All he has to do is fire, and he can level the whole place. So he insists that Venice, in essence, surrender to him, and then invite a French military cohort into the city to oversee the complete reform of Venice to a democratic system, a civil government that will be created along the French model. It's quite a testament to the Venetians. They had lost everything except for the city of Venice. There were many people who wanted to resist Napoleon, but the Doge and most of the members of the Great Council realized that it was absolutely impossible to resist, and that all they would end up with is a destroyed city. So even at that moment where the long 11th century history of the Venetian Republic is coming to a close, even then the Republic remained completely solid. The Doge came to the Great Council in the usual way. He issued proposed legislation, which was essentially that they would declare an end to the Republic of Venice. And the members of the Great Council strode up to the ballot box and cast their ballots on the issue. And in that very Republican way, the world's oldest republic voted itself out of existence. Ironically, it was sacrificed by Napoleon on the altar of republicanism.
With about a minute here, what page gets turned when the Great Council decides to end its own republic?
Well, it's the end of the republic, obviously. Venice will become, at that point, under French control briefly until Napoleon is defeated. Then it comes under Austrian control, and it will remain under Austrian control for quite a while. The Austrians actually were the ones who electrified Venice, brought natural gas there, really modernized the city. And so it would not be really until the 19th century that Venice becomes part of Italy. So in fact, it's the last element in modern Italy that would come in. There are still people in Venice who are still very, very proud of their history and still will tell you that Venice is not Italy, that Venice is something else.
Dr. Thomas Madden is professor of history at St. Louis University, author of the new book, The Fall of Republics, A History from Ancient Carthage to the American Constitution. Next time, we will talk with him about republics in the age of the Enlightenment. For information on this book, visit the Talk On Demand archives page at issuesetc.org. Dr. Madden, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Friday on Issues Etc., we'll have Pastor Brian Wolfmiller and Brian Ketchelmeyer respond to your unanswered Bible questions, and we'll begin a series with Pastor Will Whedon of The Word of the Lord Endures Forever on the word flesh in the Bible. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for listening.
Listen weekday afternoons to Pastor Todd Wilkin and guests on Issues Etc. Issues Etc. is a listener-supported program. Your financial support is vital for the continuation and expansion of this worldwide outreach. Our mailing address, Issues Etc., P.O. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. You can also donate at our website, issuesetc.org. Issues Etc. is a production of LPR, Lutheran Public Radio.